In my family, college was only for sons. That was the sentence that came to me one summer evening when I was 18 years old. My father set his glass of whiskey down on the dinner table and said it very calmly. The college money is for Jason. Girls do not need that much education. You will get married someday anyway. My name is Emily Carter. I was born and raised in the western suburbs of Chicago, in a fairly large two-story house with a lawn that was neatly trimmed every weekend. My father, Robert Carter, ran a small construction company that handled residential contracts and office renovations. It was not a large business, but it was enough for the family to live comfortably. He was very proud of building the company himself from nothing. In his mind, everything in the world followed a very simple logic. Men work, men inherit, men carry the Carter name forward, daughters do not. My brother, Jason, is 3 years younger than me. When I was in high school, my father already told everyone that Jason would eventually take over the family company. He often said it in front of guests, in front of friends, and sometimes right in front of me. Jason has a business mind. I was introduced more simply. Emily does well in school, but she will be fine. I did not think much about it until the summer I graduated from high school. One afternoon in June, I received my acceptance letter from the University of Illinois. I had also received a scholarship covering about 40% of the tuition. I remember very clearly the feeling when I opened that letter. My hands shook a little. Not because I doubted whether I could get in, but because I hoped for the first time my father would look at me differently. That evening, my mother made meatloaf, a dish she only cooked when something important was happening. I brought the letter down to the dinner table and placed it in front of my father. I got in. My father glanced at the heading of the letter. He did not read it carefully. He asked a very practical question. How much is the scholarship? About 40%. I only need about 12,000 more each year. My father took a sip of whiskey. He did not think long. That money is saved for Jason. I thought I had heard wrong. Jason is only 15. My father nodded. He will study for an MBA later. Tuition is not cheap. I looked at my mother. She did not say anything. She only cut the meat on her plate. My father looked straight at me then. Emily, you are smart. You will be fine. But girls do not need that kind of investment. He said the next sentence, as if it were sincere advice. You only need enough education, then find a good husband. Dinner continued after that. Jason kept eating like normal. My mother asked if I wanted more mashed potatoes. No one mentioned college again. After dinner, I took the letter back to my room. I did not cry. In fact, at that moment, I felt something very clear, like when you see a door close and understand that it will never open again. I opened my laptop. I searched part-time jobs near campus. That night, I applied to 3 different jobs: cafe server, high school math tutor, library assistant. Before going to sleep, I wrote one line in a small notebook on my desk. From today on, I take care of everything myself. The next morning, I still had breakfast with my family. My father read the newspaper. Jason talked about his school football team. Everything looked completely normal. Only one thing had changed. I no longer expected anything from them. 3 months later, I moved into the dormitory at the University of Illinois with 2 suitcases of clothes, an old laptop, and about $800 in savings. That was all the money I had when I started my independent life. I did not know then that the decision to leave that day would eventually lead me to another evening, 15 years later, in a luxury ballroom in downtown Chicago. An evening when, for the first time in my life, my family would be forced to look directly at who I really was. But at that moment, I only knew one simple thing. I had to go to work at 5 in the morning the next day, and college would begin in 3 weeks. The first week at the University of Illinois did not look anything like what I had imagined college would be. Other people talked about student clubs, parties, orientation events. I talked about work schedules. Monday to Friday, I woke up at 4:30 in the morning. The cafe where I worked as a server opened at 5. Most of the customers were truck drivers, construction workers, and a few professors who liked coffee before class. I wore an apron, poured coffee, wrote down bills, and learned how to remember 10 orders at the same time. My shift ended at 9 in the morning. I ran straight to the lecture halls, usually still smelling like coffee and frying oil. Classes started at 9:30. At first I thought I would get used to that rhythm quickly. In reality, it took almost 2 months before I stopped feeling exhausted. In the afternoon, I worked my second job, library assistant. The job was quiet. I arranged books, checked student cards, and stamped return dates. The only good part was that I could study between student visits. That was where I read almost all of my first-year economics textbooks. My third job was tutoring math on weekends. I taught high school students preparing for the SAT. Ironically, my father once refused to hire a tutor for me when I was in school, saying that self-study was better. But now I was earning money doing exactly that. The 3 jobs together helped me cover the rest of my tuition, the dorm room rent, and food. Not much left over, but enough. I began getting used to sleeping about 5 hours each day. Some evenings I studied in the library until nearly midnight. When I returned to my room, my legs hurt from standing too long at the cafe. At those moments, I often remembered my father's words at the dinner table before I left home. "Girls will get married someday." That sentence became a very simple motivation. I did not need to prove anything to him, but I wanted to prove something to myself. The rent was cheaper, but the room had almost nothing except a single bed, a study desk, and a small window facing the parking lot. I bought a used Honda Civic with savings and a small bank loan. That car helped me move between the cafe, the library, and my classes. I went home once during Thanksgiving in my second year. It was the first time in more than a year. Everything in the house looked exactly the same as before I left. Jason was a high school senior then. My father told guests that Jason would enter a good business school and later expand the family company. No one asked what I was studying. No one asked how I was living. After dinner, I returned to school one day earlier than planned. That was also the last time I went home during college. The following years passed very quickly. I studied more, worked more, and gradually became used to a life revolving around only 2 things: classes and work. I did not join student clubs. I did not travel with friends. I did not have much time for anything except continuing forward. By my final year of college, I was so used to that rhythm that it felt normal. One spring morning, I received an email from the academic office. The message was very short: graduating summa cum laude. I read that email in the library office. No one was around. I sat still for a few minutes and then closed my laptop. That evening, I sent my mother an email. "I graduate next month. If you want to attend the ceremony, I will send the information." My mother replied 2 days later. "Jason has an important football game. We will celebrate when you come home." I read that email twice and then closed it. On graduation day, I wore the gown and stood in line with hundreds of other students. Many of my classmates had families waiting outside the hall. I saw parents holding flowers and cameras and cheering loudly when their children's names were called. My name was read in the middle of the ceremony. I walked onto the stage, shook the president's hand, and received my diploma. No one called my name from the audience. After the ceremony, a professor from the economics department, who had taught 2 of my classes, came over and shook my hand. He said, "What will you do next?" "I want to study law." He nodded. "Good. You have a very strong analytical mind." That was the only congratulations I received that day. But I did not feel sad the way many people would expect. I had already become used to walking alone. A few months later, I received a letter from Northwestern Law School. I was accepted. Law school tuition was much higher than college, but the financial aid package, including scholarships, student loans, and part-time work, made it possible. I moved back to Chicago to begin the next chapter. Law school was much harder than college. The reading load was enormous, the debates lasted for hours, and the pressure to understand the law in detail was intense. But after 4 years living with 3 work shifts each day, I was used to pressure. I continued working part-time during law school, this time at a small law office handling financial disputes. That was where I first encountered investment files, financial reports, and lawsuits involving fraud. I discovered that I was quite good at reading numbers and spotting irregularities. 3 years later, I graduated from law school. I sent my mother a short email. "I graduated," she replied. "Congratulations. Is work at the office going well?" That was the only time she asked about my job. My family never knew exactly what I did. They only knew I worked in a law office in Chicago. Technically, that was not wrong. They just did not know that my job would eventually lead me to an evening many years later where everything in the Carter family would change in a way no one could predict. 15 years after I left the house in the Chicago suburbs, my life looked completely different from what my father had imagined. I lived in a small apartment in River North, about a 15-minute walk from my office. Not a penthouse or luxury apartment, just a quiet place where I could rest after long workdays. I worked for a large law firm specializing in financial and investment disputes. My official title was Financial Fraud Investigation Attorney. My job was simple, if explained briefly. I read files. A lot of files. Financial reports. Investment contracts. Business plans. Cash flow statements. Internal company emails. Even messages between founders. My job was to find what did not make sense. Sometimes it was only a number calculated incorrectly. Sometimes it was a business model that sounded exciting but could not realistically exist. And sometimes it was a complete startup scam. In recent years, technology companies raised money very quickly. Many investors invested based only on beautiful presentations and promises of growth. We were hired to check before the money moved. Often I only needed to look at a few spreadsheets to know the project had problems. I once helped a client avoid investing more than $20 million into a company that was later investigated by regulators for fraud. I also worked on lawsuits when investors lost money believing in projects that never existed. The job was not glamorous the way many people imagined the legal profession. Most of my time was spent sitting in front of a computer reading hundreds of pages of documents. But I liked it. There was a very clear feeling when you discovered something others had missed, like solving a large equation. During all those years, my family hardly knew anything about my work. Sometimes my mother called. She usually asked very simple questions. Is work going well? Are you busy? I always gave the same answer. It is fine. I still work at the law office. That was not wrong, just incomplete. My father never asked more. For him, the story about his children always revolved around someone else. Jason. Jason graduated from business school a few years after I left home. My father invested money for him to start a small company related to real estate. At first, it was just an experimental project. Later, Jason said he wanted to build a technology platform allowing people to invest in real estate online. The idea sounded very modern. My father was very proud. Whenever he met friends or business partners, he talked about Jason. My son is building a tech startup. Jason is developing a very promising investment platform. My mother once told me that my father said to an old friend, Jason is the real entrepreneur of the Carter family. I heard that sentence over the phone. I did not feel hurt the way many people might expect. After many years, sentences like that no longer affected me much. They were simply the way my father saw the world. In that world, Jason was always the center. I was not. And that was fine. I had built my life somewhere else with different people. My colleagues in the office knew that I worked carefully. Clients trusted me when their files were assigned to me. Sometimes we won major cases, and my name appeared in the firm's internal newsletter. Those things were enough for me. I did not need my family to recognize anything anymore. After a few years, I slowly stepped away from family life. Not because of anger, just because the distance had grown too large. I did not go home during holidays. I did not attend family dinners. Sometimes I sent my mother a birthday gift. Otherwise, our lives were almost separate. There were months when I did not speak to anyone in the family. I think everyone became used to that. Until one evening, when my phone lit up with my mother's name on the screen. And that call started a chain of events no one in the Carter family could predict. My mother's call came on a weekday evening, a few days after I finished reviewing an investment investigation file that had lasted almost 2 months. I had just left the office in River North and was walking back to my apartment when my phone vibrated inside my coat pocket. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I answered while waiting at a red light on the corner. Emily. Yes, Mom. Her voice sounded tense, like when she was about to say something difficult. Jason is going to host an event. I kept walking across the street. What event? Company launch? I paused for a moment. Although my mother had mentioned Jason's startup a few times in previous calls, this was the first time I heard about an official launch event. Where? Hilton, downtown Chicago. That was a large hotel in the Loop where companies often held conferences and investment events. I had been there a few times for legal seminars. My mother continued. About 120 guests. That is quite large. Your father wants to invite some old partners, a few contacts in the real estate industry, and some potential investors. That sounded exactly like my father. He always believed that if you wanted people to take a project seriously, you first had to create the feeling that the project had already succeeded. When? Next Saturday. 7 in the evening. I checked my phone calendar quickly. That weekend I had no work scheduled. My mother hesitated before speaking again. You could come if you want. That sentence made me stop in front of my apartment building. Does Dad know you called me? There was a short silence on the other end. Yes. What did he say? My mother exhaled softly. He said if you want to come then it is fine. I did not say anything. She continued, her voice lower. But he thinks it is not necessary to mention your job. She added quickly, as if explaining. It is just a company introduction event. Your father wants everyone to focus on Jason. I understood exactly what that meant. The Carter family always liked simple stories. In that story, Jason was the successful one. Jason was the successor. Jason was the pride. Other details were unnecessary. How many people know I will be there? I asked. No one yet. I nodded, even though my mother could not see me. That also made sense. Over the years, most of my father's friends and partners did not even know he had an older daughter. I asked one more question. Does Jason know? Yes. He said if you want to come, then come. The way she said that made it clear that Jason did not think my presence mattered. I stood still for a few seconds. After 15 years, the Carter family still worked the same way. The only difference was that now I was standing outside that story. You do not have to come if you do not want to. I looked out at the street. Cars were still passing like normal, the city lights reflecting on the wet pavement after a light rain. Part of me wanted to say no. My life had been stable for a long time, without returning to gatherings like that. But another part of me thought of something simpler. Some stories in life, if you never close them, they will always sit somewhere in the back of your mind. I did not want to carry that past forever. Finally, I said, I will come. Good. Saturday, 7 in the evening. Okay. I ended the call and stood there a few more minutes before walking into the lobby. I was not going to that launch event to prove anything, not to impress anyone, and certainly not to change the way my father saw the world. I only wanted to do one simple thing. Go there. Look at everything once. Then close the final chapter of a past I had left behind 15 years ago. Saturday night, Hilton, downtown Chicago, was glowing like a stage. The large ballroom on the 3rd floor was decorated exactly the way startup launch events usually were. Warm golden lighting, a large LED screen in front of the stage, banners on both sides displaying Jason's company logo. Servers moved between tables carrying trays of champagne and wine. More than 100 guests were already there. Expensive suits, quiet conversations, polite handshakes. I stood at the back of the room near the bar where the lighting was slightly dimmer. No one noticed me. That was perfectly fine. After many years working in financial investigations, I had become used to observing from the back instead of standing at the center. Jason stood near the stage, talking with a group of guests. He wore a dark blue suit and a silver tie. His hair was neatly styled. He looked exactly like the image of a successful young entrepreneur my father had always wanted to show people. My father stood beside him, lightly placing a hand on Jason's shoulder whenever he introduced him to someone. I had seen that scene many times in my life. Around 7:30, the lights in the room dimmed. The host stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the launch of a very promising project. The screen behind him lit up, showing Jason's company logo. And now, please welcome our founder, Jason Carter. Jason walked onto the stage to applause. He held the microphone with the confidence of someone who had practiced this speech many times. Thank you all for coming tonight. His voice was clear and steady. For many years, the real estate market has been changing rapidly. But investment opportunities have remained limited to a small number of people with large capital. The first slide appeared on the screen behind him. The company logo, A large line of text. Digital real estate investment platform. Jason began presenting. His platform would allow people to invest in real estate projects through an online system. Investors could participate with smaller amounts of capital while still sharing profits from development projects. Charts appeared on the screen. Projected returns, growth models, expansion plans. We believe technology can open the real estate market to everyone, Jason said. And our platform will change the way people invest. A few people nodded. Some took photos of the slides with their phones. I looked around the room. Most of the guests were my father's friends. Some were real estate brokers. Some were local business contacts. Perhaps a few of them truly understood technology. But most were looking at the numbers on the screen. Jason ended the presentation with a familiar sentence. "This is only the beginning." Applause filled the room. Jason smiled and gave a slight nod. The host returned to the stage. "And now, please welcome Mr. Robert Carter." My father stepped up. He always enjoyed moments like this. Standing on stage, being noticed. He held the microphone and looked around the room. "I will only say a few words." A few people laughed. He placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. "I have watched Jason work on this project for 2 years," he said. "And I can tell everyone here that it is not just a company." He paused briefly. "Jason is the pride of the Carter family." The applause grew louder. Jason looked at my father with gratitude. I stood at the back of the room and took a sip of water. The scene did not surprise me. Since childhood, Jason had always been the center of family stories. I usually stood somewhere behind them. After my father's speech, the event moved into networking. Soft music began playing. Groups of people started talking. Jason walked around the room, shaking hands. My father stood near the stage, speaking with several older guests. I was about to leave early when a man's voice sounded behind me. "Emily." I turned around. The man stood a few steps away, somewhere in his 50s. Dark gray suit, silver hair at the temples. I recognized him almost immediately. Michael Ross, a well-known real estate investor in Chicago. 2 years earlier, he had hired my law firm to examine an investment project. It had been a large deal, nearly $40 million. After 3 weeks reviewing the documents, I discovered a chain of unusual transactions inside the development company. If Ross had invested, he could have lost at least $20 million. When I reported the findings, he only said one simple sentence. "You just saved me a lot of money." We had not met again since then. Ross looked at me for a few seconds, then smiled. "It really is you." I nodded. "Good evening, Mr. Ross." He shook my hand. "I did not expect to see you here." "Neither did I." Ross glanced around the room and asked, "Are you working with this project?" I shook my head. "No." He frowned slightly. "Then why are you here?" I looked toward the stage where Jason was speaking with another group of guests. "Family." Ross followed my gaze. "Family." He looked at Jason for a few seconds, then turned back to me. His eyes showed a hint of surprise. "You are connected to this family." I nodded lightly. "Jason is my brother." Ross stood still for a moment. Clearly, he was putting the pieces together in his mind. "Carter," he said slowly. "Emily Carter." I smiled. "Yes." Ross exhaled quietly. "Interesting." He looked again at Jason on the stage. "I heard about this company a few weeks ago." "Oh. Your father called a few investors in the city." That did not surprise me. My father always knew how to build networks, Ross continued. But I did not know his daughter was the person who helped me avoid losing $20 million. I shrugged. "My family usually does not mention that," Ross laughed softly. "That is their loss." We stood silently for a few seconds. Music continued in the room. Jason in the distance was laughing loudly with another group of guests. Ross turned back to me. "Have you looked at the business model for this company yet?" I shook my head. "Not yet." "You are not curious." I thought for a moment. "My job is not curiosity." Ross smiled. "Right. Your job is finding risk." I did not respond. He looked at me a few seconds longer. "To be honest, Emily, seeing you here makes me more curious about this project." I looked at him. "Why?" Ross picked up a glass of wine from a nearby table. "Because during the past 2 years, any project where you appear, is worth examining carefully. He took a sip of wine. And I always trust my instincts. In the distance, Jason was stepping down from the stage. My father walked beside him. Ross followed them with his eyes. Then he turned back to me. Did you come here only to attend the party? I looked around the room full of lights and laughter. Yes, for now. The music in the ballroom continued softly. Small conversations carried on around the white-covered round tables. Servers walked by with trays of wine. At the front of the room, Jason still stood among a group of older guests speaking with confidence. Michael Ross remained beside me. He watched Jason for a few seconds before turning back. I am considering investing in this company. I looked at him. How much? Ross answered calmly. $5 million. That number was not huge for an investor like him, but it was still large enough for any startup to consider a major deal. Ross took a sip of wine. Jason's father sent me a project summary last week. He took out his phone. I brought a few documents. He opened a PDF file and handed the phone to me. Emily, could you take a quick look? I stared at the screen for a moment. You are asking me to work at a party, Ross smiled. I only need a quick opinion. I glanced around the room. No one paid attention to us. Everyone was focused on their own conversations. I will just skim it, I said. Ross nodded. That is enough. I took the phone. The document was more than 30 pages, but the important parts were usually near the beginning. I began reading. The first slide described the business model, an online real estate investment platform. Users could contribute capital to residential or commercial development projects. Jason's company would manage the projects and distribute profits according to investment shares. The model was not new. Many startups had tried it. I moved to the next page. Profit projections. Growth charts. Return rates. Ross stood beside me silently. About 3 minutes passed. I started reading more carefully in the financial section. The numbers were not exactly wrong, but something made me pause. I scrolled slightly upward. Profit projections. Here the company assumed each real estate project would generate an average annual return of about 18%. I frowned. That number was not impossible, but it was noticeably higher than the market average. I flipped to the next page. Operating costs. Some expenses were listed very vaguely. Project management fees, platform costs, marketing expenses. No detailed breakdown. I kept reading. On page 10, I stopped again. A data table. It presented a hypothetical real estate project and showed how profits would be distributed among investors. I looked closely at the numbers. After a few seconds, I recognized what bothered me. The profit calculation. One category of costs had been removed from the equation. Not completely wrong, just presented in a way that made the returns appear higher than they really were. I scrolled further down. Some market data had also been selected carefully. Only the years with the highest growth were included in the chart. Ross stood beside me waiting. About 10 minutes later, I returned the phone. He looked at me. Well, I thought for a few seconds before answering. It is not fraud. Ross raised an eyebrow. But I do not see evidence that they are intentionally committing fraud, I continued. But the business model is unclear. Ross stayed silent. I explained. The profit projections rely on very optimistic assumptions. I pointed toward his phone. And some profit calculations appear to be presented in the most favorable way possible. Ross smiled slightly. You mean exaggerated? I did not say that. But you are thinking it. I shrugged. That is how startups often present themselves when they want to impress investors, Ross asked. How risky? I looked again toward Jason. He was still speaking with a group near the stage. Hard to say exactly, I replied. But if you asked me as a lawyer, Ross looked directly at me. And, I answered honestly, if you were my client, I would advise you not to invest yet. Ross stayed quiet. He did not seem offended, only thoughtful. After a few seconds, he exhaled softly. I knew I asked the right person. He looked again toward Jason. Jason had just finished another conversation and was walking toward the center table where several investors were standing. Ross slowly rotated the wine glass in his hand. Emily. Yes. If you were in my position. He paused briefly. What would you ask? I thought for a second. What the real project management cost is? Ross nodded. Anything else? Whether the specific development projects are already under contract or still only plans. Ross nodded again. Good. He placed the glass on the table. I think I should ask a few questions. I looked at him. Here. Ross smiled. Why not? At the front of the room, Jason had returned to the stage to say a few additional words to a group gathered near the screen. My father stood beside him. Ross walked toward them. I remained standing at the back of the room. Only a few seconds later, Ross reached the stage. Jason saw him. Mr. Ross. Jason sounded excited. I am very glad you came. Ross shook his hand. So am I, Jason said quickly. I really hope we have the chance to work together. Ross nodded. I just reviewed the company documents. Jason smiled confidently. So what do you think? Ross spoke very calmly. I have a few questions. Jason kept his smile. Of course. Ross looked up at the screen behind him where the profit model slide was still displayed. In this spreadsheet, the project management cost is listed as 10%. Jason nodded. Correct. Ross continued. Does that cost include platform fees and marketing fees? Jason hesitated for a second. Well, mostly, Ross continued. So what is the actual cost of each project? Jason glanced briefly toward my father. My father was still standing beside him, but his expression had begun to grow serious. Ross added, his tone still polite. I just want to understand more clearly before deciding to invest. The room began to grow quieter. A few people nearby turned to look. Jason adjusted the microphone in his hand. We can discuss the details later. Ross shook his head slightly. I think people here might also be interested. He pointed at the screen. Especially since this project is currently seeking investors. Jason was no longer smiling as much as before. At the back of the room I remained standing, just watching. Because I knew one thing very clearly. In the world of investment, sometimes one correct question can decide the fate of a project. The atmosphere in the ballroom began to change. At first, only a few people near the stage turned around when Michael Ross asked the second question. But within a few minutes, the attention of the entire room slowly shifted toward Jason. Jason still stood on stage. My father stood beside him with his arms folded. The polite smile he had earlier was gone. Michael Ross kept his voice calm. As I asked earlier, he said, what is the actual project management cost? Jason held the microphone a little tighter. That number depends on each project. Ross nodded. Yes, but in the documents sent to investors, it is listed as a fixed 10%. Jason hesitated for a second. That is an average. Ross asked again. An average based on which projects? Jason did not answer immediately. In those short seconds, the room grew quieter. Some guests began looking at each other. Ross kept his polite tone. How many projects is your company currently managing? Jason took a breath. We are preparing to sign agreements with several development partners. Ross nodded slowly. So, there are currently no official projects yet. Jason looked down at the documents on the table near the stage. We are in negotiations. A few people in the room began whispering to one another. Ross did not appear annoyed. He simply continued asking, has your company received the financial license required to operate an investment platform? Jason blinked. We are working with lawyers to complete the paperwork, Ross continued. Has the application been submitted? It is in process. A man standing near the stage spoke up. So the platform is not licensed yet, Jason quickly responded. We have not launched officially. Ross nodded lightly. Understood. He looked at the screen behind him. What about your technology partner? Jason answered more quickly this time. We are working with a group of programmers to build the system, Ross asked. Which company are they from? Jason looked slightly uncomfortable. At the moment we are working with freelance contracts. A few murmurs spread through the room. One investor near the bar whispered to someone beside him. No official tech team, Ross continued. Where did the company's initial capital come from? Jason glanced at my father. My father stepped forward. Our family supported the early stage. Ross turned toward him. About how much? My father answered firmly. About $2 million. Ross nodded. So the company is still operating with family capital. My father did not answer immediately. The atmosphere in the room became more tense. Some guests even set their glasses down to listen more carefully. Ross continued, his voice still calm. Honestly, I just want to understand the risk before investing. Jason held the microphone but did not speak right away. A few seconds of silence passed. Then, Ross asked another question. Does anyone in your family have financial experience to review this project? That question caused many people to glance toward my father. My father frowned. What do you mean? Ross answered simply. I just think a project like this should be reviewed by someone with professional expertise. He looked around the room. For example, a financial lawyer. A man standing near the back suddenly said loudly, Emily is a financial lawyer. The sentence echoed clearly. Within seconds, many eyes turned toward me. I was still standing near the bar. My father followed the direction everyone was looking. When he recognized me, his expression changed. Emily. Several guests began whispering. Emily Carter. Who is she? The man who spoke earlier added. I remember hearing her name in an investment investigation. Michael Ross turned toward me. A few people in the room began walking closer. A woman around 40 asked, Are you really a financial lawyer? I placed my glass of water on the table. Yes. Another person asked. What field do you work in? I had not planned to say anything more, but now the entire room was watching. Michael Ross said, Emily once helped me avoid losing $20 million in a fraudulent investment. That sentence surprised many people in the room. A man near the stage turned and asked. Ross nodded. I hired her firm to review an investment project. He looked at me. She discovered suspicious transactions before I signed the contract. Several guests began looking at me differently. My father stood on the stage, clearly unprepared for this situation. Jason still held the microphone but said nothing. An investor walked closer to me. How long have you been doing this work? I answered calmly. More than 10 years. You investigate investment projects. I review financial records, company structures, and legal risks. Another person asked. Have you reviewed Jason's project? The question made the entire room quiet again. I looked toward the stage. Jason was looking at me. My father, too. I spoke slowly. I did not come here to evaluate my brother's project. I paused briefly, but Mr. Ross asked me to look quickly at the documents earlier. A few guests leaned in with more attention. An investor asked. And, I answered directly, I did not see signs of fraud. Jason quietly exhaled in relief, but I continued. However, the business model still has several unclear areas. A few guests looked at each other. The projected return rates are quite optimistic, I said. And some market data may require further verification, a man asked. So what do you think about investing? I answered calmly. If someone were my client, I would advise them to study the project more carefully before making a decision. No one spoke for a few seconds. I did not say those things to embarrass Jason. I only answered the question people asked. But in a room full of investors, sometimes a few honest sentences are enough to completely change the atmosphere of the entire evening. The ballroom atmosphere was no longer the same as before. Small conversations had turned into serious discussions. Some investors near the stage were speaking directly with Michael Ross. Others opened their phones to review the documents Jason had presented earlier. Jason still stood on the stage, but now he spoke very little. An older investor spoke first. I think we should review the numbers before making a decision. Another nodded. Yes, this model needs more verification. Ross spoke plainly. I will pause my investment until an independent due diligence report is completed. That statement sounded like the closing signal. Several others immediately agreed. We will do the same. Better to review more carefully. My father stood beside Jason with a tense expression. Jason held the microphone but said nothing further. About 10 minutes later, the launch event ended earlier than expected. The music stopped. Guests began leaving. Some still shook Jason's hand politely, but the atmosphere was completely different from the beginning. The excitement of a breakthrough project was gone. Only the caution of investors who had begun asking questions remained. I left the hotel before the room completely emptied, but as I stepped into the hallway, Jason called behind me. Emily. I turned around. He stood a few steps away, his face clearly trying to remain calm. Are you satisfied now? I looked at him. What are you talking about? Jason laughed dryly. You know exactly what you did. I shook my head. You were asked questions because investors wanted to understand the project. Jason spoke faster. But you did not have to answer like that. I looked at him for a few seconds. Did you want me to lie? Jason stayed silent. I continued. I did not say your project was a scam. Jason did not respond. I only said people should examine it carefully before investing. Jason looked down at the floor for a few seconds. That was my launch event. I nodded slightly. But you were asking other people for their money. Jason said nothing more. I turned and walked away. 3 weeks later, I read an email from Michael Ross. He attached an independent due diligence report. A group of financial experts had reviewed Jason's entire business model. Their conclusion was clear. The project was not ready to raise investment. Some profit assumptions required adjustment. Some costs needed recalculation. And the business model needed revision before the platform could realistically operate. Jason had to postpone the startup launch plan. There was no scandal. No public scandal. Just a project that was not ready. A few days later, my phone rang. The caller name appeared. Dad. I looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering. Emily. His voice sounded quieter than I remembered. Yes. A short silence followed. I did not know you did those things. I understood he meant my work. I stood by the window of my apartment, looking down at the Chicago street below. It is okay, I said. You did not need to know. He stayed silent. For the first time in many years, our conversation did not contain arguments. It did not contain attempts to prove anything. It was simply two people talking. After a few short sentences, the call ended. My story does not end with a dramatic revenge. No one was destroyed in front of a crowd. There was no loud victory. Only a party where people began asking questions. And for the first time in my life, when those questions appeared, people turned and asked me. Not because I was someone's daughter, not because I belonged to the Carter family, but because of the work I had done for many years. Sometimes change does not come from a dramatic moment. It comes from something very simple. The person who was once ignored in the story is finally heard. If you have listened to this story until now, I am curious about one thing. If you had been in that room that night, what would you have done? Would you stay silent so the family launch event could continue smoothly? Or would you say what you truly saw? Leave a comment if you would like. And if stories like this make you think a little about family, money, and difficult choices in life, you can like or follow the channel. I always read those comments.